didn't know any better, and so we're just leaving it. So welcome everybody, and we're having a hour conversation with the New Biology Clinic team about this common sense child rearing. Um, and as you know, I asked people to buy the book, actually two copies, one for you and one for somebody you know with children, between noon and 1 today, so it jacks up the rankings, and then I get on Oprah to talk about why you shouldn't vaccinate your child. Whether that happens or not, it will remain to be seen. Um, but the first thing I want to say, there's two first things. Hey, Adam.
Yeah.
One is it when you go to Amazon, it says that it's out of stock, and then before it said they won't deliver it until July. And the reason for that is because the publisher, Steiner Books, had a slight delay in getting it to Amazon. And so that triggers sort of algorithms that tell them that they're out of stock, and that's why they put it on there. But I know they have been delivered, so it's not going to be July, and they just, for whatever algorithmic reason, have to put that there. The second thing, which I want to be very clear, and I did a whole show on how this book came about, which because my Chelsea Green editor asked me to write something about how to raise healthy children in a toxic world. I want to be clear that I am not an expert on child rearing. In fact, I used to say I have three of my own children, one stepchild, seven grandchildren, 20 some years as a Waldorf school doctor. But I used to say that if they ever gave out a Worst Parent of the Year award, I would have been in the running at least a few times for that. And I know that some of the people here, like Adam, has 12 children, and I happen to have met them, and they're about the sweetest children I've ever met. So for me to be telling Adam how to raise children is weird. But anyways, I wrote the book, so here we go. So just to say that, and it partly came because I'd say I had a kind of revelation about dealing with children, mostly around when my youngest was around 12 or so. And that's really was what inspired the book. And I told a story about how to get on your child's side. That was the very first chapter of the book, and what being on your child's side means. Because I found in working with parents and children, a lot of the times you couldn't say that the parents were on the child's side, and the children knew that, and the teachers weren't on their side. They were telling them all the kind of things that were wrong with them, and you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do that, and you've got attention deficit and oppositional defiant disorder, and that's not what I mean by being on your child's side. So I already went through that, and the next story I wanted to say is sort of a reflection of that, or a continuation of that, and it has to do with discipline. And I consider this a very practical book, so I'm going to read just one page, and it sort of encapsulates the two things, so-called discipline and being on your child's side. So, the first story is about an experience with my grandson, Ben. At the time, he was around 4 and staying with us along with his brother and my daughter due to their family circumstances. Most every morning, I would go get Ben from the cottage where he slept early in the morning, as we were the two earliest risers. Mostly, we would come to our house and be downstairs with his blocks and wooden animals, building the farm for the day. Sometimes he would use his crayons to draw pictures. One morning, I heard a grandpa in an unusual voice, and I knew I should go look. Ben was standing there with a crayon in his hand and pointing at the wall. On the white wall was a fairly large drawing. I took a deep breath and said, At that point, I had some options. One was to ask how this happened. I chose not to because it was obvious. The next thing was to tell him somehow that this was not a good thing. I chose not to say this either because it was clear from him having called me down that he was aware of this. I could have punished him somehow, taken away his crayons, or called his mother, but instead I just said, let's see if we can fix this. We, with the help of Grammy, got out the paint, sanded it over, and covered it with some paint, and it was more or less fixed. Drawing on the walls never happened again, and we made sure he always had some paper to draw on. Again, it's not that I liked him drawing on the walls. It could have even been a costly mistake, but it still seemed to me that the approach I took was the most effective to not only remediate the situation, but to stop it from happening again. The other point here, which I keep coming back to, is my cardinal rule from chapter 1. Get on your child's side and stay there. By not punishing Ben and instead spearheading the cleanup effort, it was clear I was here to help him, not harm him. He responded, as would most people, with thanks and relief, and even joined in my effort to help. And partly this came out of, I don't know if you guys have had this experience, but I've had, over the years, I've had a lot of pediatric patients. And so I'm sitting in my room, an office, and there's all kind of tools and tongue depressors and paper and all this. And it got to the point where I even sometimes counted the number of times that the parents either scolded or said no to their children. And I remember in 1/2 hour, my world's record was 23 times the parents told the child, don't do this. And you know how many times the child listened? None. And so if I was to summarize what the purpose of that, what that parent was attempting to teach the child, it was, don't listen to me. And they successfully taught the child that, because the child never once listened, no matter whether they threatened him to get ice cream or not ice cream or anything, child simply didn't listen to them. And I thought, if there's any better way to not do this, it's to continually say no to things which either don't matter or you have no ability to carry out your command or whatever it is. And so I used to tell my patients, this week you get to say no once a week. That's it. So you better make it a good one. You better really make sure that you don't want that to happen. And you better make sure that it doesn't happen. And to me, that was the opposite. And so with Ben, I could have said, how bad he was and he shouldn't have done that, and et cetera. But he already knew that. It was the other thing that I sort of discovered is he knew he shouldn't have drew pictures on the wall. That's why he called me down. There was no intellectual reason that I needed to get that through to him. For whatever reason, he did it, and the effective approach was to say, yeah, that happened, let's fix it. He willingly joined in, and it never happened again. And that was the end of it. So that's the first story. And if you think like that, and I don't know how many, I used to sit in Waldorf school classes, and I would hear the teacher threaten like every 2 minutes, if you guys don't be quiet, if you sit in a public school class, you will hear every 2-3 minutes is some threat, don't do this, don't do that. Nothing ever happens, nobody ever listens, and all you're doing is teaching people not to listen. and they learn. Now, the other one I got, and then I'll stop, is this became my, and this, you could say, well, what does this have to do with health and medicine and all that? And I actually think it has a lot to do with it because here I ended up, and this came after the book, so this story isn't in the book. Like, what is the purpose of a child? That's a funny way to say it, like what is a human being? But one way to say it is the purpose of a child is like this spiritual being who comes into this incarnation, into this world with amazing gratitude to their parents for giving them life and wants to give them something back. That would be one definition. So imagine this. Now, the other thing, and we've talked about this in new biology medicine, I learned to always ask the question, if I was this person's wise body, what would I do in this situation? Like, what would the wisest thing to do in any situation be? Right? So those are the two things. So you come into this world, this newborn baby, with incredible gratitude and love for your parents for giving you life. You want to even give something back to them. And you have this incredibly wise body, this magnificent being that knows, what's right. Okay? That's the scenario. So you come into this body, you get born. Day one, what happens? They inject you with a bunch of poison agreed on by your parents for a sexually transmitted disease caused by a virus that doesn't exist. Right? Interestingly, this called Hep B, day one. Now, interestingly, they could have easily, if they really believed that story, they could test the mother and see if she has Hep B and find out if she doesn't, there's no reason to inject the child. But they don't do that. They just inject all the children. So imagine, and I could ask you guys this, here you are, this newborn baby. What would you do in that situation? Like, you can't have a conversation with your beloved parents and say, guys, I've been listening to Cowan and Kaufman, and they say there's no viruses, and I don't really think you should do this. And that flu shot you keep getting, I don't really like, I don't think you can't. So what do? You cry. Right? And then you stop, because it goes away. But then the whole thing happens again at 2 months. They take care of you and mostly breastfeed you and stick you in a room by yourself, a little bit too much, but it's mostly okay. But then comes 2 months and they inject you 3 different times at the same visit with these concoctions of God knows what. And you're like, what the heck is this about? You guys got to not do this stuff anymore. But you can't get it through. And then they do it again, and they do it again. And I thought to myself, if I was this child, what would I do? And the answer I came to was, I would make their life miserable. Right? Because if it got so miserable, they might say, honey, we better think about this. Like, this may not be the right way to go about doing this business of raising this child. And if that doesn't work, I'm acting goofy. And that's called autism. Right? Because now their life is hell. I'm getting them up all hours of the night. They can't sleep. They can't go to work. They're losing their job. And you can hear this. It's like a real crisis for a lot of these parents. Or I can't breathe, They keep injecting me and poisoning me and putting me in houses that are outgassing all kinds of stuff. And I can't breathe, so I get asthma. And I'm saying to these people, like, we got to get this together. And you too, because you're not so healthy either. Like, you keep getting shots and flu stuff and everything. And so the question then, so that's how I started looking at this. And then, I didn't know if this was right, right? So in other words, this does, and by the way, you also have the problem of the poisoning of the shots and all the other things, right? So it's not just the communication strategy. You also are actually poisoned. You got two problems. But I remember this, and so one I'm thinking about this, and I still remember this encounter. This guy who was like 5, who was the most quote autistic child I'd ever met. The second was the child of a guy who was a sort of nationally known child psychologist specialist uh, who specializes in the psychological treatment of autism. His child was the worst, but this guy was second. I mean, you could not be in the same room with him. And they were one of these people who came and said, "We've done everything," which of course is never true, right? They've done a lot of things, but that's an exaggeration to get your attention. Whenever somebody says they've done everything, they're just trying to make a case for themselves. We've done everything, and he won't eat the diet. He won't eat the GAPS diet. He won't take the medicines. He won't do anything. And he's just ruining our lives. And so I explained how I saw this, that it wasn't his problem. It was your problem. He's trying to get through to you to change the way you live. And as soon as I was done, this guy who's like tearing my office apart goes and sits down next to his mother, folds his arms like this, and looks at her. Like, what are you going to do with this? And I was shocked. Uh, I was shocked. And he sat there and he listened to the conversation. And she said, "Okay, we're just going to do things differently as a family. We're going to talk to each other." They were having lots of marital problems. And we're not going to try to treat him at all. He's not the problem. He's just communicating to us that there is a problem. Next thing you know, he's not only eating the GAPS diet, because they changed that, eating it willingly, and actually tells his mother, go to Dr. Cowan and ask him if I can eat like bananas instead of oranges. So he's like into it. 6 months later, I mean, it was almost as if didn't have autism. And that story, I mean, it blew my socks off. I thought, and it really came about because we took, it wasn't his disease. He was just communicating that this cannot go on like this, the way you guys are living and thinking and blaming me. I'm not the problem. I don't know any other way to communicate what's happening. And as soon as we realized that, he didn't have to act like that anymore. And I got to the point where sometimes I would say to the children, like when the parents weren't like listening, "You don't have to act like this. I will tell your parents to act different, do differently. You don't have to do that anymore," because to me, it like got to be like a habit, right? They always acted like that because they're trying to get their point across. And if somebody helps them out, then they can like a little bit give it up. All right. So that's my child rearing spiel for today. And I'd love for you guys to uh, pipe in with whatever you've come to, thought about, or anything that I just said, or how you see it differently or the same. So whenever you feel like piping in, have a conversation about what is it,
Um, I
Rod?
think it's yeah. Um, I'm glad you you wrote the book because it helps so many people as a resource to start a learning process and how things are really different from what we've been taught or being used to adopt customs for how our parents raised us and
Yeah.
how parents were raised. And so it becomes sort of a behavioral imitation of the same mistakes, and nobody asks the question, is there any better way?
Yeah.
Many times we pay attention a lot to, what kind of vehicle we want to purchase, and we look at every single detail and technology, but we don't spend the time in finding out what's in the vaccine or the shots I'm going to give to my child, what's in the food I'm going to give to my child. Well, how is the language communication of the children to the parents? And so that is to me a very jewel that you have delivered to the world to start a process of um, leaving that cognitive dissonance that we still have in many aspects of not only health, but in many other areas that we have to have an impact with the children.
Yeah. I can't emphasize how much this will help your life as a parent. Like I had a whole chapter on food fights. There's so many parents who come in and the main complaint, the main thing that's like, you know, interfering with their life is food fights, right? They can't get their children to eat what they want and it goes on and on every day, et cetera. Now, when I was in Swaziland and living with a Swazi family, in the 2 years I was there, one time a child said, "I didn't want to eat this in poo tonight." And you know what happened? One of his brothers took his plate away and ate it. And that was the end of it. And and the and what I learned is food fights are never about food. They're about autonomy. That everybody should be given the right to choose whether to eat something or not. Just like you guys do. And I do. I don't eat stuff I don't like. Children, if they don't like it, they shouldn't eat it. If you give it to them because you think it's good for them or whatever, and they they don't want to eat it, fine. They just don't eat. You don't punish them or berate them or whatever. You just eat their food. That's what they did in Swaziland. You know how many times that's ever going to happen again? Never. And it was 100% effective. As long as you don't go into it with punitive energy or good boy for eating your food. Like, why? It's just food. You just eat it. Like, I'll bet Adam has something to say about that because I'll bet your 12 children don't go on about they're not eating this food. I don't like it. I think you're muted.
Yeah, we can't hear you.
Is that any better?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can
Yeah.
hear you.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, I'd say kids are great at humbling you, right? Because anytime you think you got it figured out, they'll teach you. So that's one thing I always say about kids is it's definitely a learning process. As far as food goes, like we are talking about, yeah, kids will not starve themselves. So I think for me as a parent, it's about giving them good, healthy choices, right? We don't want to give them the wrong choices and processed toxic foods, but if they have good, healthy food in front of them, they'll make the right choices and they won't certainly starve themselves. Um, I was going to go back to the first story that you had told in the book, I think in chapter 1, Tom, about the young man who was having difficulties at school. And to me, that's such a profound story because his big issue was he was being lied about, right? And I think that's something that is so lost oftentimes in our society, is that we have these little white lies. We think it's okay to lie to our children, and it's not right to lie to anybody. And certainly nobody appreciates it, and kids don't appreciate it. So
Yeah.
I think one of the most important things is to be open and honest with your children when you're raising them. And again, sometimes these things we're not even conscious of them, right? They're just part of our upbringing, and then we kind of start to share them with our kids, and they're like, wait a minute, you're not telling me the truth here.
Yeah.
And as your story points out, that doesn't sit right with anybody. Nobody wants to be lied to. So as the kids come in and they see things aren't right, they'll do their best at trying to get attention, right? And like you
Yeah.
said, sometimes what they do to get attention might be a little bit disruptive, but that's probably the best they know how to do.
Yeah. I mean, he wanted out of there because they were lying about his behavior in his mind, and it doesn't matter whether he was right or not. And when I listen to him, I don't tell them that, yes, you are correct, right? I just listen to his side of the story. And that's what he thought. And my suspicion is he was right. And then he said to himself, obviously, because he wasn't conscious, I'm getting out of here. And so the best way is to do something like they'll kick me out of school. And that's what he did.
Yeah.
Made perfect sense. Now, if you don't want him to get kicked out of school, he's perfectly reasonable guy. You just don't lie to him. And then he won't throw the vase. And that's what happened.
Yeah. And then I really like the story you brought up today about your grandson. I find oftentimes, so you put yourself in that situation where there's something you kind of seen that, okay, this, you know, something happened here. We shouldn't probably be writing, crayons on the wall. But I think oftentimes in my own experience, if I get in that situation, it could be pretty upsetting, right? And so one option would be to start, yelling, right?
Yeah.
But I think that one of the principal points of how we respond to any situation is, are we responding from a perspective of helping the child, or are we kind of responding from a selfish perspective, right? I'm just gonna
Yeah.
let my emotions out. Or oftentimes we see situations maybe in public, right? And we'll see that the parents trying to save face for themselves, right? So how they treat the child is not at all in the best way that's going to help that child. It's very much from a perspective of the parents embarrassed, and now they're trying to save face. And so that's one thing I've tried to learn, or hopefully have learned, is when you're approaching a situation, are we approaching it to try to help the child, to improve their ability to respond to the situation next time, to help nurture them, right? Because I think that's one of the primary goals, is the responsibility as a parent is to nurture the child. And so many times are we just doing it based off our own immaturity emotionally that we're going to respond to, or are we trying to save our own face here?
Yeah.
And a lot of times, yeah, you gotta suck it up and do what's right for the child. And it comes back to your first chapter, whose team are you on? Are you on your child's team, or are you playing on a different team?
Adam, I tell you, I know that experience so well because with one of my children, I used to go to these situations, think, don't act disruptive. Every time I thought that, first thing he would do is, is mess something up. Because as long as it was about me, this is about me. What are people going to think of me? Like, oh my God, it's comedy. Such a look at his child. You know, had to teach me it wasn't about me. Once I learned that, he didn't act like that anymore. Because what's the point?
Well,
Yeah,
one of the things
fascinating.
I'd like to point out is I love this approach because we should be very curious about children. They come, they're so close to God. They come right from spirit, right? So I encourage people who have children to ask them, we think they're making up stories. How do we know they're not telling us what they remember? When a child feels really heard and held, they're going to be a very easy child to raise.
Yeah.
And it's really pretty interesting what they'll say to you. And sometimes they'll give you information about people in your ancestry that's true. And they'll show you, like, I really do know some stuff.
Yeah.
And no child's going to be disruptive when the parents sort of honor the lesson that that child came in to teach everyone. It's just a very beautiful approach.
And exactly. And it's similar to how we treat our friends, right? If a friend draws on the wall, you don't go, you just don't, you wouldn't do that. And by the way, other children don't do that to other children.
Right.
If they do, they get ostracized big time. Like, no, we don't want to be around this person because they have this weird energy. But if you say, yeah, how did you end up coming to that? They just like a friend, they tell you. It doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't mean you have to believe them. But a lot of times it's pretty damn interesting.
They're really excellent teachers as well. I remember when my son was 2, we were in a mall and we were walking, and there was this woman scolding her daughter, about the same age as my son. She had put her in a timeout. And my son walks up to the little girl and says, "Are you okay? Why are you crying?" And the mother glared at me, and I was just like, "Oh, he's so sweet," and if the mom could have only seen, like, my son's giving her some interesting information here,
Yeah.
It was just like, if they really do know what to do. They're so
Yeah.
sweet and innocent until we scold them into, something else. It's just interesting how we raise children in this culture sometimes.
Yeah. And I think people put in the chat, oh, well, if you just let them eat whatever they want, aren't they just going to eat candy all the time? But here's the way it works. Once you let them choose whether to eat it or not, they will let you choose what to feed them. Because they can't tell you what to feed them. You're not going to give them candy bars and stuff. You're going to give them the food that you think is right. And they can eat it or not. Once that's clear, they don't care about the food. Or one of my sons said, well, could you give me broccoli instead of collard greens? So I did. But he didn't care. He wasn't like, I'm never going to eat this food. He was just trying to piss me off and teach me that that's not how you deal with other human beings, by bullying them into eating food they don't want to eat. Until I got that, he was going to piss me off. And so I stopped. And then it wasn't any fun for him to try to piss me off because it wouldn't work. All right. Omar and Mark. Rodney, go ahead.
You're saying, like, that you should try and be on your child's side, and I totally agree with that. And another way of something that we had come to the conclusion of was that and been given advice for was that you should try and keep your child's heart, and it's very similar sort of viewpoint. But I think sometimes it's helpful to think of it in terms of that, like that there is an emotional connection as well that you want to keep, because when things get tough, you want that to be a rope rather than tissue paper. So if you need to pull on it, that it doesn't just break. And so that because sometimes you might be like, I'm on your side because I know what's best for you at the moment, and I'm going to tell you about it. But there's also that emotional heart connection that you need to keep and nurture and grow stronger, so that if you need to pull on it in the future, that it's not just going to break. And like Adam was mentioning, these little white lies, like those are the things that really undermine the strength of that, because it's like, are you someone that I can trust? Well, I'm not so sure, because some of this stuff doesn't really add up, and I think we sometimes underestimate their intelligence, their ability to recognize what's going wrong, or as I'm becoming more aware of our biofields and things like that, that there's something off about your field, and that even though they can't necessarily articulate it, like the autistic kids you were talking about earlier, they know that something's off. And that also, because we're going to make mistakes, like we're going to tell the white lies, even if we don't know, even if we know better, like, oh yeah, no, I'm not going to do this anymore. You're going to do it. And so you need to be able to say sorry. And that is bloody hard. It's really hard, especially when you're like, I'm someone that you should respect and honor, and you should do what I say because I know what's best for you. And then to have to come and say, look, I don't always do what is best for you, that you're like, surely that's undermining my my credibility here. But what I learned is that it's actually the opposite. And there's a couple of things. One is that they know when something's off, even if you're pretending to yourself that they don't. And that then if you can model what to do when you make a mistake, which is to own it and take responsibility for it, you give them the tools to do that later. But the reason why a lot of us haven't had that is because that we don't do it very well is because we haven't had that modeled. But you get to put a line in the sand or a stake there and say, well, that's not what it's going to be like for this next generation. I'm going to give them better tools. And so, yeah. So I would just say practice saying sorry.
And Mark, I don't know if you would agree with this, but it's one thing if you're telling this child like day in and day out what to do. It's another thing if I'm not saying there aren't times when you may have to protect your child or tell them what to do, like big time. But if they know that you're only going to do that, when you're sure and when it's really like this is crucial, this is like life or death, then they do it. If you're after them every day, clean your room, it's like, wait a minute, like you just doing this nonstop all the time. I'm tuning you out. I don't know if
that's so important, especially with teenagers.
Yeah.
Because developmentally, they are rebelling. They are really in that I'm going to stand in my independence. So if you're on your kids for all of the things, they're not going to listen to you when there's actually a real danger.
Yeah.
And you need them to listen to you when there's a real danger.
Right. If it comes up, they have to listen to you. And if you're blowing that day in and day out, don't listen to you. Don't play music. Don't go for a walk. You got to eat Cheerio. It's like, no.
Right.
All right, Rodney, I think you had something you were going to say there a minute ago.
Oh, no, but but I will say something that Pam alluded to about how this new spiritual being comes in the world and sort of inhabits this physical body. Children world. They learn experience and interaction first with their parents, but are very intuitive into what really is happening around them. So sometimes we tend to underestimate how aware are they of their surroundings and how they perceive the interaction between their loved ones, in this case, the parents who are nourishing at that time early in life. And what happens at the physical level, depending on those interactions, are going to manifest. And that's what I think sometimes kids who develop so-called diseases can be manifestation of that interaction with their parents, with their friends, or whoever is around them who cares for them, and also the things that are being fed or injected or put into their body unknowingly that is being toxic to them. So that the point that you made at the beginning, that why is this important for health? I think it matters a lot from early in life to get on their team to understand that interaction of a spiritual being having an experience on a physical body and how we transform that experience for the best.
Yeah. Yep. Omar, did you have something you wanted to?
Well, as the youngest parent amongst you, I have learned a lot to learn, and I'm looking forward to read the book. However, since you emphasized on the first chapter about getting on your child's side, I have learned about this studying scripture. Maybe I can share the part that said that. So in Genesis, there's the story of Joseph when he recounts to his father having seen 11 planets, the sun, and the moon bowing down to him. In Genesis, Jacob rebukes his son. He says, "What is this vision you're telling us? Are we going to prostrate to you, your mother and I, and your brothers?" This is very, very different from what the Quran says about this particular vision that Joseph recounts to his father, because his father, right away, he warns him about not telling his brothers. May they plot against him out of jealousy, and he tells him further about this vision, like he adds in it. He believes him. From that point, the stories are completely different. And so the Quran comes saying it is correcting some parts that have been changed, and you get to see like that getting on your child's side really does make a big difference.
Yeah.
So that is one thing.
I mean, and this is, to me, it's also, it became a very practical thing. Like, and probably some of you have had this experience. I don't know how many parents, because I was a school doctor, and so dealing with the children who were having trouble, the parents would come in and say they want their child on drugs, like Ritalin. And you think, do you have any idea? Like Ritalin, as far as I know, actually, atrophies your cerebral cortex, right? So that's a problem. I mean, that's a weird thing to say, but that's like a problem. So you mean you want to do that to your child? That's what you mean? Well, my child is not behaving and he's never going to learn. And if he doesn't learn because, our whole society is based on school, he's going to flunk school and then he's going to end up in prison and blah, 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 right? The whole thing that comes from that. So they're afraid. Parents are afraid. And therefore, they, in a sense, take an antagonistic position to the child. I'm going to do this to you. And I saw that over and over again, and it's similar. I think the reason is like what Mark was alluding to. The parents are essentially afraid they're going to be outed as an incompetent parent. And that's driving the show. So they're going to show everybody in their school that, no, my child can behave right. Even if I have to drug him up so he's just sitting there like that in class, at least he's not causing trouble. That's what's motivating it, not helping my child. That's what I mean by being on the child's side.
Yes, because parents tend to be afraid of having a special child, someone that would be above average in any way. So they want.
Yeah. It drives a lot of medicine, this very thing. I don't want you to act in a way that, outs me.
Well, I mean, that's all of medicine, right? As a psychiatrist, I can say, like, I can never imagine how many people have been brought to me like, this person isn't behaving in a culturally acceptable way, drug them, and it's always been interesting how often I was fired because it was such a ridiculous stance to me. that we would drug someone so that they stay in line. But that's exactly what our school system is doing, is they're going, stay in line, or, you know, we're going to send your kid to get an evaluation to be drugged, right?
Yeah.
And I always point out too, it's really interesting. I ask parents, you know, people who really change the world for the better, if you look at their story, they never stayed in line. Why do we
Yeah.
want people to stay in line? Doesn't make
Yeah.
any sense.
Where's the line going?
Right.
I
And
think it's helpful. I think it's helpful to take that stance that of kind of like, well, yeah, I am an incompetent parent. I still do make lots of mistakes, and so, but I get to learn from each of these ones. That's what's called an anti-fragile ego, which means that it doesn't matter if people come up to you and tell you that you're incompetent, or that it stops you from being afraid of looking incompetent, because you kind of like, oh, I already know that, like, and so,
right.
and I see it as an opportunity to learn. And
Right.
so this John Wilmot, this made an impact on me for a long time. John Wilmot said, I used to have 6 theories about parenting and no children, and now I have 6 children and no theories.
Right. Yeah, it really takes the sting out of these things if you admit beforehand, A, you don't know, or B, you don't, I'm not good at this. Because then when they come back, well, what right do you have to say about? Right, I already said I'm not any good at it.
Yeah.
So it's no big deal. All right, Adam, uh, you're muted.
Muted. Okay, sorry.
There you go.
We're there. Yeah. Yeah, as it's been brought up again, a lot of these maybe issues we're talking about with parenting are obviously reflecting greater societal, cultural issues, even in medicine, right? People don't want to deal with the root cause, right? They don't want to deal with, and so with parenting, they don't want to deal with their children, right? And so that's where a lot of this is, like Tom's example of the autistic child, and certainly we see poisoning with, you know, injections and that being part of this as well. But the child screaming out, and definitely in many cases, the parent doesn't want to deal with that. So they're just, bring him, rush him here, rush him here. They want something to fix it instead of them stopping and listening to the child. So I think there's a huge part of the parenting that really demands your attention and your time, you being present. And I think things naturally develop there in parenting when you are present, and they actually require time, right? And that's a difficult thing. We might be pulled in many different directions in our lives. You can't get away from the needs of the child unless you give them the time that they need. A young child, holding them, an older child, talking to them about whatever they're going through, right? So addressing their needs takes time and being present, and I think that's critical. And some people just don't want to deal with it. They don't want to give that time
Yeah.
to the child.
It reminds me what you're saying of the Grail mystery and the Parzival story, where the question that unlocked the healing was just when they asked, "So what ails you?" If you just ask the child and you're willing to listen to whatever they say, that's the hard part, because they may tell you that it's got something to do with you. What is wrong? Not to scold them. Oh no, it's not this. Like, it couldn't be me, or it couldn't be the food, or it couldn't be the vaccines, or it couldn't be the way that my husband and I interact. Couldn't be any of those things. So you're wrong. That's not what that question means. It means, just from your point of view, what are you seeing here? And when you really convey to a child that you're going to listen no matter what they say, I don't know how many times I had children. I'd come in and say, "What's up?" And not, how many brothers and sisters do you have? I have 3 sisters. Mother, and by the way, I always would tell the parents, you're not allowed to interrupt the child. And the mother would forget about it and say, wait a minute, you have 4 sisters. No, I have 3. I can guarantee you that there's something going on with the interaction of that 4th sister. Because from that guy's point of view, she doesn't exist. And the parents will insist they not say that. And I would say, so what's up with the other one? Well, you should see what she does to me, or whatever it is. That's where the story is. But if you tell them they're wrong or you don't listen, you're never going to get it. Yeah.
So good. Kids spell love Time, and so you've got to be prepared to take the time to listen.
Yeah. And they know that's another definition of a child is, for me anyways, that person who knows your weak spots more than anybody. They know exactly where to get you. Better than anybody alive. They know. All right. Anybody else have any final words? I think we're good. All right, everybody, go buy the book. And yeah, thanks for joining us. And thanks, everybody, for participating.
Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right. Bye-bye.